I have governed Varenholt for 11 years without flinching. I have sat across treaty tables from men who wanted my lands, my wolves, my life. I have held my face still while they smiled and calculated. I have signed agreements and broken alliances and done what the kingdom required, and I have felt, through all of it, the particular stillness that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you will and will not do. I did not expect to lose that stillness at a harvest feast, over a woman I had known for 3 years without ever truly seeing. Her name was Lyra. She had come to Varenholt's court as the apprentice of old Merk, the court herbalist, and when Merk died of a winter fever in his 78th year, she had simply continued his work, quietly, without asking for appointment or title or pay increase, though she received all 3 in time because the court functioned better with her in it. The East Wing apothecary ran with more order than it ever had under Merk. The healing stores were catalogued, the drying racks organized, the sick wolves who came down from the Northern Patrol returned to their posts faster. She was efficient and unobtrusive, and I had in 3 years spoken to her perhaps 9 times. I could have told you the color of her working apron. I could have told you that she moved through a room as though she had mapped it in advance. No wasted steps, no startled gestures, the kind of composure that makes powerful men feel clumsy by contrast. I could have told you that she kept her dark hair pinned back with 2 cedar picks, and that she smelled of dried sage and something sweeter underneath, and that on the 3 occasions she had spoken to me directly, her voice had been even and unhurried in a way that most people's voices are not when they speak to a king. I could have told you all of this, and I would have told you it meant nothing beyond the basic inventory a king keeps of the people in his care. I would have been wrong as it turned out, but I did not know that yet. The autumn feast at Varenholt runs 3 days. It is the largest gathering of the year, pack lords and their seconds, the merchant guilds, the wolfkin from the hill settlements, a handful of guests from neighboring kingdoms who come to trade goodwill and eye our stores. My steward Aldous organizes it with military precision. My role is to sit at the high table, receive the season's reports, maintain my alliances, and project enough authority that no one tests whether I mean it. I do not particularly enjoy the feast, but I am good at it, which is the next best thing. The first evening ran as expected. I sat between my Chancellor Bren and Lord Havard of the Western Ridge, and I listened to Havard's complaints about the river toll with the portion of my attention the complaints merited, while the rest of my attention moved across the hall as it always does, reading the room, noting who spoke to whom, tracking the small negotiations that happen in the margins of large gatherings. Lyra was there because the court herbalist always attended the first feast night, a tradition Merk had maintained and she had continued. She was not at the high table. She sat near the east pillar with the court's administrative staff, Aldis's people, the archivists, the garrison physician, and she was, as she always was, composed and contained and not calling attention to herself in any particular way. I noticed her in the way I notice most people in a room, filed her presence, set her aside, returned to Havard's river toll. Severin of Caldermere arrived late. I knew Severin. Everyone in the surrounding territory knew Severin. He was the lord of Caldermere's eastern hold, newly titled after his father's death the previous winter, and he had spent the intervening months doing exactly what a newly titled lord does when he is ambitious and attractive and aware of both, moving through every court in the region with his easy smile and his careful charm, gathering impressions and leaving them. He was not a bad man. I want to be precise about that, because what followed might otherwise seem like a judgment of his character, and it was not. He was simply a man who knew how to enter a room, and he entered my feast hall with the particular ease of someone who has never had to try very hard, and has therefore never learned caution. He made his greetings to the high table first, as courtesy required. His bow to me was correct, and his conversation was brief and intelligent. He did not overstay, did not push. I revised my impression of him upward by 2 degrees and thought, here is a man who could be a useful ally in the Eastern Corridor if he remains this sensible. Then he moved into the hall, and I returned to Havard, and the evening continued. I could not tell you exactly when I became aware that Severin had found Lyra. It happened gradually, the way a change in weather happens. You do not notice the moment the air shifts, only that at some point the quality of the room has changed, and you have been aware of it for longer than you realized. One moment I was listening to Bren's commentary on the grain assessment, and the next I was watching, with more attention than the situation warranted, as Severin sat down in the empty chair to Lyra's left and introduced himself. She looked up from her conversation with Aldous. Whatever expression crossed her face was too far from the high table for me to read with certainty, but she did not look alarmed, and she did not look unwilling, and she turned toward him with the same unhurried composure she turned on everything. He said something that made her smile. I looked away, I picked up my wine, I listened to Bren. Bren said something requiring a response, and I gave one, and it was apparently the right one because he nodded and continued. I do not remember what we said. I was thinking, with a clarity I found difficult to explain, about the fact that Severin of Caldermere was sitting to Lyra's left and she had smiled. This was not a political concern. She had no rank, no alliance value, no position that made her movements diplomatically significant. She was my court herbalist. She was free to speak to whoever sat beside her at a feast. These facts were all evident to me, and none of them in that moment made any difference whatsoever. I watched the rest of that conversation for another quarter hour without appearing to watch it, a skill 11 years of governance provides. And then the music shifted to the harvest rounds, and the feast moved toward dancing, and I stopped watching because watching was already beginning to feel like something I would not be able to explain. I told myself with some firmness that I was tired, that the feast was long, that nothing was happening that merited a second thought. I went to bed that night and did not sleep for 2 hours, which was unusual for me. I did not examine why. The second feast day is given over to the guild presentations and the seasonal council, and I spent the morning in the great hall receiving reports and the afternoon in my study with my chancellor working through the agreements. Lyra was not present for any of this, which was expected. It was not her domain, and I was conscious, with a sort of low-grade irritation, of noticing her absence. She came to the evening feast. Severin was already there. I had not, in the daylight hours of ordinary work, particularly thought about Severin. He was a guest. He would attend both remaining feast nights and depart on the morning of the 4th day. He was not a concern. And yet when I saw him cross the hall toward Lyra's table with the particular purposefulness of a man who knows where he is going, something in my chest registered it with an alertness that had nothing to do with alliance politics. I watched him greet her. She looked up, and again there was something in the quality of her attention, a small aliveness, a slight brightening, that I had not seen directed at anything else in 3 years of noticing her peripherally. And I thought, with an uncharacteristic lack of clarity, that is a thing I have not earned. It was an odd thought. I filed it away. I spoke to my guests. I ate. I did not watch Lyra's table more than was reasonable for a man responsible for the well-being of everyone in his hall. I watched it somewhat more than that. What I was watching, though I would not have named it this way then, was whether she was comfortable, whether he was careful with her, whether the attention he directed at her was the kind that asked something of her or the kind that simply offered. I am a man who reads the difference without thinking about it, and what I read across the length of the hall was that Severin of Caldermere was being infuriatingly, genuinely kind, not performing, not calculating in any visible way, simply attentive. She deserved attentiveness. Obviously she deserved it. She was composed and intelligent and had managed the court's healing stores with more skill than the man before her. She deserved every consideration a guest could offer. I knew all of this, None of it helped. When the feast began to move toward the harvest turn, the traditional partnered dance of the second evening, the one where guests offer their hand and the recipient may accept or decline, I became, suddenly, very still at the high table. I watched Severin rise from his seat. I watched him cross the small space between his chair and hers. I watched him extend his hand, palm up, in the formal gesture of the harvest turn, graceful, unhurried, a question without pressure. I watched her look at his hand, then up at his face. And then I was standing. I do not remember deciding to stand. I do not remember the moment between watching and moving. One moment I was in my chair, the 11 years of cultivated stillness intact, and the next I was on my feet and stepping down from the high table with the kind of deliberateness that only looks calm from the outside. Bren said something behind me. I did not hear it. The hall was very large. It took me perhaps 15 seconds to cross it, and in those 15 seconds I was aware of several things: the music still playing, the dancers moving, the precise location of Lyra's table, and the fact that my right hand at my side was not quite still. I reached the table. Severin turned at my approach with the instincts of a man who has learned to read a room. His expression shifted, not to alarm exactly, but to a careful recalibration. He was smart enough to know something was happening, and uncertain enough about what it was to hold very still. Lyra looked up at me. Her face was composed as it always was, but there was something in her eyes, something waiting, or something already knowing, that I could not read and could not stop looking at. Severin's offered hand was still extended toward her. My hand closed around his wrist. It was not a grip of anger. I want to be precise about this. It was not a warning, not a threat, not the beginning of a confrontation. My grip was firm and careful, the grip of a man who has placed his hand on something he has just discovered he was not willing to relinquish, and I did not know, in the moment I did it, what I intended to follow. What I knew was the bond. It hit me in the second my hand closed, not a slow dawning, not a warmth building over time the way the old stories sometimes describe it. It was immediate and total, like the moment a door opens onto a lit room when you have been standing in the dark. A recognition behind the ribs, deep and certain, the kind of certainty that does not argue with itself because it does not need to. My wolf, who had been still and businesslike and ungovernable about nothing for 11 years, went somewhere entirely different, not aggressive, not possessive in the crude sense, but present in a way he had never been. Attending, certain. "She is yours," he said, and did not mean it as a claim on her. He meant it as a fact, the way the river is in the valley, and the stars are where they always were, something that existed before I understood it. The mark on my collarbone, the mate mark I had carried since my 20th year, dormant and theoretical, a formality of the blood I had long since stopped thinking about, burned. Not painfully, like the return of a circulation that had been quietly absent for so long I had stopped noticing. The hall had noticed me. I was aware, in some part of my attention that was still functioning normally, of the music tapering, not stopping, but softening, the musicians following the shift in the room's attention the way good musicians do. I was aware of Bren at the high table, very still, of Lord Havard with his complicated expression, of Aldous, who had the look of a man mentally composing a report he did not yet have words for. I looked at Severin. He was watching me with the careful intelligence of a man who has just understood something significant and is deciding how to respond to it. His wrist was in my grip. He was not pulling away. I said, "Forgive me." I meant it. It was not a dismissal and it was not a threat. It was the apology of a man who had done something involuntary in public and was now obligated to account for it. I did not intend to interrupt. Severin was quiet for a moment. He looked at my hand on his wrist. He looked at Lyra. He looked at me. "I see," he said very quietly, and then, "I don't believe you did interrupt." I believe I was uninformed about the nature of the situation, and the error was entirely mine. He was being still, infuriatingly gracious. I released his wrist. He inclined his head to Lyra, a small, genuine bow, and then he inclined it to me, and then he withdrew, unhurried, with a dignity I found myself, despite everything, respecting. The hall let out a breath it had been holding. I looked at Lyra. She was looking at me, not at the space where Severin had been, not at the hall around us, at me, with an attention that was nothing like the composed peripheral awareness she usually directed at the world. This was direct and still and slightly puzzled, and underneath the puzzlement, something else, something that was not surprise. She said very quietly, so that only I could hear, "Your collarbone is glowing, my lord." I looked down. The mate mark, visible above my collar, was emitting a faint gold, not dramatic, not blazing, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Half the hall knew what they were looking at. "Yes," I said, "I'm aware." "I thought mate marks were—" She stopped, reconsidered. "I thought they activated at the first sight of the bond's other half." "They do," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "You have known me for 3 years," she said. "Yes." Another pause. I watched her work through it, not in distress, not in confusion, but with the careful, methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. The way she catalogued her medicines, the way she assessed a patient, moving through it piece by piece. "You didn't know," she said. It was not an accusation, it was a conclusion. "No," I said, "I didn't know." She looked at me for a long moment, this quiet, composed woman who moved through rooms like she had mapped them in advance, and then she said, "What did you think it was when you felt it?" It was the most direct question anyone had asked me in years. I thought about lying or deflecting or choosing the version of the truth that put me in a better light. I am a king. I know how to do all of those things. "I thought I was tired," I said. Something in her face shifted, not amusement exactly, closer to recognition. "That is," she said carefully, "a very king-shaped answer." "I know," I said. The music had restarted around us. The hall had resumed, the way halls do, life filling the space that tension vacates. People were dancing. Havard was talking to someone. The feast was continuing. We were standing between a table and the edge of the dance floor, the two of us, while the mark on my collarbone faded from gold to something quieter, and I had no idea what came next. This was not a condition I was accustomed to. "I'm not going to offer you my hand," I said finally. "That seems," I paused, "presumptuous given the circumstances." "That seems wise," she agreed. "But I would like to speak with you," I said. "Tomorrow, not at the feast, not at the high table. Somewhere that isn't—" I gestured at the hall around us, which was the wrong gesture for a king to make, indicating too clearly that I found my own hall inadequate for the conversation I needed to have. "Somewhere quieter." She considered me for a moment. "The East Garden," she said. "I'm there at dawn before the council sessions, if you wanted to come at dawn." "I'll come at dawn," I said. She nodded once, the same efficient nod she gave to everything that had been decided, and then she turned back to her table, and I turned back to the high table, and the evening continued. I will not pretend the rest of that feast night was ordinary. The mark on my collarbone had ceased its visible glow, but the sensation it had carried did not fully recede, the awareness, the orientation, the sense of some internal compass that had been spinning for years abruptly finding north. I spoke to my guests. I finished my wine. I performed, adequately, the role of a king at his own feast. My wolf was insufferably smug about all of it. He did not say anything, exactly. But he had the quality of a creature who has been saying something for 3 years that no one listened to, and who is now very content to have been proven correct. I did not sleep at all. The East Garden in late autumn is not the East Garden in summer. The vines have gone to bronze and the beds are mostly cleared. the herbs cut back to the root for winter. But Lyra's section of it, the apothecary beds along the south wall, was still working. Some things prefer the cold, she had told me once, in passing, during one of our 9 previous conversations. The late harvest herbs, the ones that only give what they have to give when the season is ending. I had not thought about that conversation since it happened. I thought about it, walking to the garden at dawn, quite a lot. She was there when I arrived, as she'd said she would be. Working, because she was always working, something with a bundle of dried stems, separating and ordering them with the same efficient attention she gave to everything. She did not look up when I came through the gate, which meant she had heard me coming and was not going to pretend she hadn't. I found the low stone bench near the south wall and sat down, which was not the posture a king usually adopts, but standing over her while she worked felt incorrect. She finished what she was doing. I had the impression she would have finished it whether I was there or not, which I found, inexplicably, a relief. And then she sat on the edge of the bed wall across from me, her hands resting in her lap. The morning was cold and very quiet. The keep was not yet awake. Somewhere in the northern yard, a wolf was moving through the patrol changeover, but it was distant. I looked it up, she said, last night after the feast. I waited. Mate marks, she said, the dormant ones, the delay mechanism. And there isn't one, she said, a delay mechanism, I mean. The texts all agree that the mark activates at the first recognition point, the first moment the bond registers the other half, which should mean, she looked at me with the directness she had not dropped since the hall. You have been in the same court with me for 3 years. Yes, I said. That's a long recognition window. I've been told, I said carefully, that the bond can be blocked, internally, not deliberately, not consciously, but I stopped. This was difficult to say. I was not accustomed to things being difficult to say. If a person has spent enough years governing what they let themselves feel, the bond signal can apparently be, I searched for the right word, organized. Put in a category that makes it feel like something else. She was quiet, considering this. What category did you put it in? She asked. I thought I was keeping inventory, I said, of the people in my care. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but adjacent. For 3 years, she said. I am very thorough, I said. This time it was a smile, small but genuine, the kind that arrives before the person decides to have it. I felt my wolf rearrange himself with satisfaction. I need to tell you something, she said, and her voice had shifted slightly, still even, still composed, but with a carefulness that meant she was about to say something true and was making sure she said it correctly. I am not going to be claimed because a mark activated and a room full of people saw it. That isn't, I'm not something that can be claimed by an event. No, I said, I know. I want to make sure you know, she said, because you are a king, and kings sometimes conflate the moment of recognition with the thing itself. That's fair, I said. The mark is a signal, she said, not a conclusion. Yes. So, she said, she folded her hands in her lap. What I want to know, what I am going to need to understand, if any of this is going to make any sense, is what happens after the signal, for you, what you actually intend. It was the most direct question. Again, she kept asking them, and I kept finding with some surprise that I was able to answer them. I intend, I said slowly, to learn you. That's the honest answer. I have had you in my court for 3 years, and I spent those 3 years filing you into a category that didn't fit, and I started again. I would like to understand who you actually are, not the inventory, the person. She looked at me for a long moment. That, she said, is a more honest answer than I expected. I'm working on it, I said. The corner of her mouth moved again. I will need to think, she said. I don't mean about whether the bond is real. I've read enough to know the mark doesn't activate on false readings. I mean about the other part. What it means to, she considered her words, to step into a different position in this court, to be the subject of whatever the hall is going to say about last night. The hall is going to say whatever it's going to say, I said. I'm not particularly concerned about the hall. No, she said, you wouldn't be. You've had 11 years of practice not being particularly concerned about the hall. I've had 3 years of being invisible to it, which is a different experience. This landed, I felt it land. You're right, I said, that's a fair distinction. She nodded slowly. I'm not saying no, I'm saying I need time. How much time? I said. I don't know yet. Would it help, I said, if I came to the garden again tomorrow, or would that be? Come to the garden, she said, not to press, just to, she paused. I am better at thinking through things when there's someone to think alongside. It's a failing of mine. It doesn't sound like a failing, I said. No, she agreed, it doesn't always feel like one. We sat in the cold garden for another hour. Not in silence exactly. She asked me things, practical things, the kind of questions a person asks when they are genuinely trying to understand the shape of a life rather than performing interest in it. She asked about the governance of the Northern Holds and what I found difficult about it. She asked what I wished I had known before I took the title at 22. She asked, once, what my wolf was like. I told her. I found with some surprise that I had answers to all of it. She told me in return about the 3 years of her apprenticeship under Merck, who was brilliant and exacting, and had never once told her she was doing well. About the year after his death when she had run the apothecary alone and had been uncertain every day whether she was doing it correctly. About the small satisfaction of a well-organized store of medicines, which she recognized was not a thing most people found moving, but which she found consistently, quietly, sustaining. I thought about 3 years of inventory. I thought about what I had filed and not looked at. When the keep bell rang for the morning council, we both stood. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, I said. She went back to her herbs. I went back to the keep. I spent the council meeting with a portion of my attention on the treaty language, and a portion of it on the precise quality of the silence in a cold garden in late autumn, and Bren gave me 2 looks across the table that I chose to ignore. Severin of Caldermere departed on the morning of the 4th day, as planned. He came to take his formal leave of me at the high table, and he was, as he had been throughout, entirely correct, his bow precise, his manner easy, no trace of resentment or wounded pride. He was a man who knew how to lose a thing gracefully, which made me revise my opinion of him upward yet again. My lord, he said. My lord, I said. He paused and then, she's remarkable, not as a consolation, not as a needling. As a simple statement of fact, offered between 2 men who were both, in different ways, telling the truth. I hope you're aware of that. I'm becoming aware of it, I said. He nodded, inclined his head once more, departed. I stood at the high table for a moment after he left, and my wolf made no sound at all, and I thought, yes, I am becoming aware. I went to the East Garden every morning for 17 days. I want to be precise about this because I think the precision matters. It was not a campaign. It was not a king pursuing an acquisition. It was, and I am still reaching for the right language for what it was, a man showing up in a cold garden each morning to sit across from a woman who asked him direct questions, and finding, each time, that the answers were more available to him than they had ever been before. She was careful, not guarded exactly but deliberate. She did not move faster than she understood, and she asked me things I had to think about before I could answer, and there were mornings where we sat for an hour and she said very little, and I could feel her thinking from across the garden bed. I found I did not mind this. I had spent 11 years in rooms where every silence was a negotiation, and every pause was someone calculating their next move. The silence in Lyra's garden was not like that. My wolf during these mornings was very quiet, attentive, not pushing. It was the quietness of a creature who has been proven right and is content to wait for the rest of the world to catch up. On the ninth morning, she told me about her mother, who had been a hill settlement herbalist before the fever year, and how she had come to Varenholt at 14 after the settlement was reduced. I did not press for more than she offered. I listened. On the 12th morning, I told her about the first treaty I had negotiated, at 23, which I had got wrong in a way that cost the Northern Holds a decade of disadvantage. I had not told this to Bren. I had not told it to anyone. I did not entirely understand why I told it to her, except that the garden seemed to be a place where inventory did not apply. On the 14th morning, she said, out of the middle of a silence, "You have stopped watching the door." I looked at her. "When you first came to the garden," she said, "you watched the door for the first few minutes of each visit. Not obviously, but I noticed." "Habit," I said. "I watch entrances." "Yes," she said, "but you stopped around day 9 or 10. I think you stopped when you stopped calculating." What was I calculating? She considered whether this was going to go as you wanted it to. I thought about this, and now, she said, "I think you've decided you don't know how you want it to go. You've just decided you want to be here." "Is that an observation or a question?" I said. "Both," she said. "Then yes," I said, "that's accurate." She nodded slowly, looking at her herbs or through them. "I've decided something," she said. I waited. "I'm not afraid of it," she said. "That's what I needed to find out. I thought I might be afraid of the size of it, of what it would change. But I've been here for 17 days thinking about it, and I'm not afraid. She turned and looked at me directly, with the full attention she had given me in the feast hall. "I'm curious about it, what it would be like to be known like that, by someone who is trying to learn instead of categorizing." "I can't promise I'll never categorize," I said. "It's a strong professional habit." "I know," she said. "I'm a herbalist. I organize things for a living. I understand the impulse." A pause. "I'm saying I'm willing to see where it goes, with care, and slowly." "Slowly," I said. "You are a king," she said. "You run on a different pace than everyone else in this keep. Slowly is going to have to be intentional for you." "I can be intentional," I said. "Can you?" she said. The question was genuinely curious, not an accusation. I closed my hand around a man's wrist in the middle of my own feast because I could not remain in my chair, I said. "I would call that evidence of the opposite." She laughed. I don't know if I can adequately explain what that moment was, the sound of her laugh in the cold garden, the way it was unguarded and sudden and very small, the way it changed the quality of the morning, the way the arrival of sun through clouds changes a field. I was not a man who had been unmoved by laughter before. But I had not, before that morning, sat in a garden for 17 days learning a person piece by piece, and the laugh arrived at the end of all of that like the last word in a long sentence that finally makes sense. My wolf made no sound. He simply held very still in the way that means, pay attention, remember this, this is the one. "Slowly," I said again, "with intention." "Yes," she said. "And with," I said, "the understanding that I will make errors, because I will. I have 11 years of habits that were not built with this in mind, and I will almost certainly apply them incorrectly at times." "That's honest," she said. "I'm working on it," I said, the same words as before. She recognized them, and something in her face was warm. "All right," she said. She stood from the garden bed wall and brushed the cold soil from her gloves. "Then we'll see." She went back to her herbs. I remained on the bench for a moment longer than I needed to, in the cold quiet of the late autumn morning, while the keep began to come awake around us. I will tell you how it was in the months that followed, because I think the shape of it matters. It was not a grand declaration. There was no ceremony at which I presented her to the court and the pack bowed. Or rather, that moment came later, in its own time, and it was quieter than such moments usually are in the stories. What the months were, primarily, was the slow and effortful and sometimes clumsy business of learning to be known. Lyra had been right that I ran on a different pace. I would realize in the middle of a council session that I had not thought about the garden in 4 days, and the realization would arrive as a particular kind of discomfort, not guilt, exactly, but the awareness of a wrong proportion. She never said anything. She was not the kind of person who tracked debts, but I began to learn to track them myself, which required a muscle I had not previously exercised. She was patient with me but not indulgent. When I said something with a king's bluntness that required softening, she said so directly and without drama and waited for me to try again. When I slid back into categorization, and I did more than once, old habits are not rewritten in a season, she would say with that particular evenness. That sounds like inventory. And I would stop and think and start over. She moved slowly. I had promised slowly and I meant it mostly. There were moments when my wolf wanted to be otherwise and I had to govern him, which was not entirely unlike governing a difficult council but required different instruments. I gave her what she asked for. In return, she gave me something I had not known to ask for: the experience of being around someone who did not want anything from me that wasn't the truth. My court watched. They were not impolite about it. Bren was too disciplined for that, and Havard had had his curiosity satisfied at the feast and moved on to more productive interests, and Aldous simply adjusted his seating arrangements for subsequent events without comment, which was Aldous's way of accepting a new reality. The garrison physician stopped making his weekly herbalist visits quite so formal, which I took to mean he had noticed the change in Lyra's standing and was adjusting accordingly. Severin of Caldermere sent a short note in the winter. It said only, "I hope the slow pace is serving you. Warm regards." I showed it to Lyra. She read it and smiled and said, "He's a good man." And I said, "Yes," and we left it at that. The mark formalized in the deep winter, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but in the way such things happen when they are ready. She was in the garden, even in the cold, because she always worked through the cold, and I had come down early before council, and she looked up when I came through the gate, and something in the look was different from the looking I had watched for months. It was settled. The way the valley is settled after the last frost has passed and the ground knows what it is again. I sat down on the bench. She came and sat beside me, which she had not done before, always across, always the garden wall between us. She sat beside me and we looked at the stripped garden together, and she put her hand on the bench between us, palm up in the way that meant, "If you like." I covered it with mine. The mark on my collarbone warmed, not with the sudden fire of the feast hall, with something quieter, the warmth of a thing completing rather than beginning. Hers, on her wrist where it had appeared quietly in the weeks following the feast, answered in kind. We did not say anything for a long time. "Still slowly," she said eventually. "Still slowly," I said. "Good," she said. We sat in the cold garden in the thin winter light, and she was warm beside me, and my wolf was entirely silent, not the silence of waiting, but the silence of arrival. The deep, settled quiet of a creature who has been searching for a long time and has finally come home. She became Varenholt's Luna in the spring, in the small ceremony she had requested, not the full pack gathering, not the formal rite in the great hall, but the garden ceremony, with the pack representatives and the court gathered in the east courtyard, with the vines just beginning to come back and the apothecary beds showing their first green. The pack bowed. Not because I required it, I required nothing. They bowed because by then they knew her, most of them, from 3 years of the apothecary and the winter months of watching a king learn to walk at a different pace, and the bow was the pack's way of saying, "We know what she is now. We know what she cost him to see, and we know what he learned in order to see it." She stood beside me in the garden she had cultivated for 3 years, and she was as unruffled as she had been in the feast hall, as composed as she always was, and there was only one moment that broke through that composure. When Aldous, who had known her since her first week in the court, presented her with the Luna's seal and said, with the particular formality Aldous never abandoned. On behalf of the court of Varenholt, welcome, my lady, to where you have always belonged. And she looked at the seal in her hands for just a moment too long. I leaned close and said, very quietly, breathing is optional but recommended. She breathed. And then she laughed, the small sudden laugh of the cold garden, and I thought, that laugh, that is the thing I will have arranged my whole governance around, and I would do it again. The last thing I will tell you is this. There is a bench in the east garden that no one has removed, even though the Luna's quarters are now in the keep's east wing, and the apothecary has expanded, and she no longer needs to sit on a garden wall to have a conversation. It is still there. On the mornings when the council is not in session and the diplomatic business can wait, I come down to the garden and she is there, working, because she always works, and I sit on the bench, because it is still the right place to sit, and we think alongside each other in the cold or the warmth depending on the season. She asks direct questions. I answer them more often than not. I still occasionally categorize. She still tells me when I'm doing it. My wolf on these mornings makes no sound at all, just the deep and satisfied stillness of a creature who has been trying for a long time to show his king something, and who finally, on a feast night, in a hall full of witnesses, over the extended hand of an unsuspecting visiting lord, succeeded. I did not know what I had in the inventory for 3 years. I know now. She is in the east garden, and I know.